13 Tales Told by a Dubliner, be Turlock con me. Story number 5. Headless Wanderers. My father used to tell me stories about the pubs in Dublin, though he wasn't a drinking man and didn't go to pubs himself. But he knew about them. He'd heard the stories. For one thing, he told me about fellas that used to go on the bona fide. What that meant was as follows. There were strict enough licensing laws in them days under the British, and you couldn't always get a drink when you wanted one. An exception was made for pubs along the main roads in and out of Dublin. They were allowed to serve drink as well as food to travellers who had such needs. Mind you, they had to be bona fide travellers, the law said. There couldn't be local fellas who just wanted a jar. Needless to say, the locals would do their best to pass themselves off as bona fide travellers, even though they were nothing of the sort. What's more, fellas from the city would travel out to these pubs to get drinks. They would do it late at night during the week, and they'd especially do it on a Sunday. This was known as going on the bona fide. Me father's uncle Frank, who was a terrible drunken bowsy, was a great one for going on the bona fide. Now, one of these bona fide pubs, as they were called, was Dead Man Murray's out in Lucan. Me father liked to tell the story of how it got its name. It seems there was a fella in there drinking, and he on the bona fide. He staggered out of the pub late that night and onto the road outside and started to walk along the tram line. He was overtaken by a Lucan tram, which neatly decapitated him. Nowadays, me father said, this was in the 1950s and me a chiseler, there's no tram line any more, but if you walk along the road at night where the tram line used to be, you'll meet a headless man walking. It's the drinker looking for his head. Eventually, when I was a young man, I happened one night to be in that area, and I went into Dead Man Murray's, where I heard more about the ghost, or ghosts. This must have been around 1966. Now, Lucan wasn't very built up then, and the old pub was at the side of the old Lucan road. By this stage, there was no sign of a tram line, of course. When I went in, there weren't all that many there, and there was no trouble to sit on a stool at the bar and order a pint, which I did. I got into conversation with the barman, as you sometimes do when things are quiet at the bar. Actually, he turned out to be the landlord, Jem McCarthy, and I asked him about the case of the man who lost his head. I told him I'd heard a story from my own father years ago, and me only a chiseler, and I was wondering if there was anything in it. The landlord was quite willing to take part in an exchange of stories. He addressed himself to another man who was standing at the bar having a pint too. This was Eamon, an old regular, as he explained. This old man had a good memory for details. The incident, he said, warming to the story right away with a pleased smile, happened on the 2nd day of August 1908, and it involved a Lucan man named Felix Brothers. Brothers? I asked. Aye, Brothers, that was his name. That's a queer name, says I. What sort of a name is that? I've never heard of it. Well, it really is an Irish name, though it doesn't sound like it. It's an English version of O'Broder or O'Bruder. Oh, I see, I said. I remembered the poet, Dahi O'Bruder. Aye, but I only know the name. Do you not know the English version of that poem of his that was done by James Stephens? That lanky hank of a she in the inn over there nearly killed me for asking the loan of a glass of beer." Eamon and the landlord laughed at this, and I went on. "If I asked her master, he'd give me a glass a day, but she, with the beer at hand, not a gill would arrange." Another laugh. I broke off. "That's O'Brualer for you. But at a certain point his descendants must have started to be called Brothers. I didn't know that." "Well, this Felix Brothers I'm telling you about must have been one of them," said Eamon, going on with his story. "At any rate, he was drinking here all Sunday. He was supposed to be on the bona fide, and you know about that, I suppose." I nodded. "But of course he wasn't, and him a local boy. Well, he was much the worse for wear, and it well after dark when he left to go home. He went outside, and maybe not being too steady on his feet in the night air, he walked along the tram line on the old Lucan road outside there. Maybe he tripped and fell and was lying there, I don't know. But his luck was against him. For the Lucan tram heading into Dublin overtook him, and it cut off his head. So he was killed stone dead, although the driver of the tram didn't realise what had happened and just drove on." "So what was the upshot of it?" "An inquest was held, and the coroner at the time said that it was his own fault, and he drinking in a bona fide pub when he was from Lucan. And he found no fault with the tram driver. So that was that." "But the story is still remembered," I said. "Why is that? Is it because of the ghost?" "Because of the ghost," said Eamon, and looked at the landlord with a nod and a smile, as if his suspicions about where this inquiry was leading had just been confirmed. Everybody in Dublin has heard that story. It's said that, ever since that time, you may meet a man walking along the tram line in the dead of night. When he comes up to you, you see he has no head. It's the ghost of the unfortunate Felix Brothers. They say he's looking for his missing head. Sure, there hasn't been a tram line there now since the year of Dot, and they pulled up the rails long ago. But your man is still out there, walking along the road, and you can still see him." "Have you seen him?" "Indeed I have, and so have many who have passed in and out the door of this pub." "And that was how the pub got its name, Dead Man Murray's." "Well, there's more to it than that, isn't there, Jem?" For an authoritative reply, the old man turned to the landlord, who had been listening attentively. Said the landlord, "It really goes back much further than that. The pub was always known as Murray's, though there hasn't been a landlord on Murray for 200 years or more." 200 years? I asked incredulously. "Aye," he said, "for the pub was first heard of in 1702, and it was called Murray's then. It was away out in the country at that time, far from Dublin, on one of the main roads, the Lucan Road as it was called. Murray's was a coaching house, which meant that the stage coaches in and out of Dublin would stop there to change horses, and for the passengers and the coachmen to have rest and refreshment as they pleased. It seems the pub got its name, Dead Man Murray's, in the time of the 1798 rebellion. Do you remember Lord Norbury?" "Oh, aye," I said, "the hanging judge. There's many a story about him. He sentenced Robert Emmet to death at Green Street Courthouse in 1803. "That's him," said the landlord, nodding. "The famous hanging judge." "I heard one story about him," I said, anxious as a young fella to contribute to the impromptu history session. "He condemned a man to death for stealing a watch. But even with the black cap on, he couldn't resist a little joke. He said, 'Aha, you rascal, you reached for time and grasped eternity.'" "That would be him all right," said the landlord. "And I heard another one about him," I added. "He'd sentenced the fella as follows: 'I sentence you to be flogged from the custom house to the opposite quay.' The man shouted, 'Thanks, Lord Norbury, you've done your worst.' "And back again," said Lord Norbury. Now, for a man to be flogged from one side of the Liffey to the other was a severe punishment. To be flogged there and back meant almost certain death. The boat chuckled grimly. "And here's another one about him that brings him closer to Robert Emmet," I added. He was at a dinner at the Viceregal Lodge over in the park. Sitting beside him was Mr. John Philpot Curden, the father of Miss Sarah Curden, Robert Emmet's fiancée, and himself a well-known forensic orator in Dublin. A dish of meat was passed. "Is this hung beef, Mr. Curden?" asked his lordship. Mr. Curden replied, "No, your lordship hasn't tried it yet." Eamon spoke up at this point. "Aye, he was a hanging judge all right, and Robert Emmet seems to have had him at his worst. Yet, according to the stories from that time, he didn't find it easy to condemn young Emmet in the dock, to be hung, drawn and quartered for high treason. After he'd passed sentence with the black cap on his head, they say he broke down and wept. So he must have had some human feeling. But it was the only time anyone saw him show any compassion to anyone. Or maybe it was just compassion for himself. More like it." "Fair enough," says I to him. "But then, what does Lord Norbury have to do with this place? We never heard that story." Both Eamon and me turned to the landlord, who had just been pulling a couple of pints for customers who had come in. "Well now, it seems he was a hanging man already in 1798, said Jem. "That's where he made his fearful reputation. One day in that year, in November it was, he had had a long day convicting men for their part in the rebellion, and he told his coachmen to get him home quickly to his house out in Clane, and says he, don't spare the horses. Well, while they were on their way, the coachman's assistant was taken very ill, and so the coachman slowed down to let him off at Murray's, in order that he could go in there for some rest and refreshment. But Lord Norbury leaned his head out the coach window and demanded to know why they were stopping. The coachman told him the circumstances, but Lord Norbury was having none of this, in the foul mood he was in. "Move," the justice roared, "or I will have ye flogged and hanged." Well, the coachman took fright and whipped up the horses, and the poor unfortunate who was just getting down from the box went sprawling on the ground. The coachman hoped his pal would get up and go into the pub, but it seems he never did. He just lay there in the road and died of exposure during the night. He was found the next day by the locals, and they brought him into the inn and laid him out on a bed there and arranged for his burial. There was an inquest on him held at the inn, and the verdict was, death be misadventure. So you tell me that was how the place got its name, Dead Man Murray's. Is that it? Apparently so, said the landlord, and nodded sagely. Speaking of inquests, said old Eamon, that was another reason why pubs like this got names like Dead Man's Inn. Whenever there was a fatal accident out on the road, the body was brought to the nearest inn, and the inquest was held there. So it seemed there was more to the story in the name of the pub than meets the eye. I had just gone in there for a jar or two, and I left a bit before closing time. I'll be off now, I told them, so good luck to yous. They both smiled, and the landlord Jem McCarthy said to me, I enjoyed your stories and your conversation. Eamon said to me, may you not meet the dead man, and he winked at the landlord. I thought little of it. Good luck, I said, and out I went. It was a spring night, as I recall. There was a fresh smell from the trees as I started to walk along the road. I could hear leaves rustling overhead. There wasn't much noise. There was hardly much traffic, just the occasional car going by. I walked along the road, hearing my own footsteps in the quiet. I stopped for a moment. It seemed eerily quiet all of a sudden, like as if the air was heavy with expectation, and something important was going to happen. There was no traffic at all, no one passing on the road, no sound from the nearby houses. What an odd kind of a feeling. It seemed to me that something was going to happen, but it didn't really involve me personally. So I took it sort of stoically, ready for whatever it would bring, and started to walk along again. I hardly heard the sound of my own footsteps now. As soon as I was walking in the darkness, I saw the figure of a man in the distance. He was coming towards me. He was just a dark silhouette picked out by the few lights at the side of the road. He walked heavily, slower than I was walking, so it took a while for us to get close to one another. I saw he was wearing a dark suit and a white shirt with no collar or tie. When he came near, I saw that he had no head on his shoulders. I didn't yell or scream or anything like that. I felt sort of numbed. He just walked past me, and him with no head on him. He was going out of town, and I was going in the opposite direction, towards town. So you may depend on it I kept on the way I was going. Just once I dared to look around over my shoulder, and there he was going along the road in the direction of the pub. The next time I looked, he was gone. Or had he disappeared? The old Lucan road was a quiet road in them days, like I said, and I kept on walking, whistling a tune to keep me spirits up. I was heading for a house near Lucan, where some friends were expecting me for a late night shindig. I reflected that I'd have a story or two to tell them when I got there, and us sitting around the fire. After I'd walked for upwards of 3/4 of an hour, I was feeling relieved to be away from the headless ghost, because that was what he was, without a doubt. But soon I saw a man walking ahead of me in the same direction as myself. Who could this be? Someone else. It must be someone else. I kept walking. I could hear my own footsteps, but I didn't hear his, even when I got close. And as I got close, my heart sank within me, for I saw he had no head. How could this be? I had left Brothers far behind, going in the opposite direction. I lingered fearfully behind this man. I was afraid that if I stopped, he might stop and turn around. I could see he was carrying something before him in his hands, though in the darkness it was hard to be sure. Soon we came to a gate at the side of the road. He turned and went in. Overcome by curiosity, I looked in the gate where he had gone. It was a graveyard. It occupied a small low hill, and on the top of the hill was what looked like a ruined church or chapel, roofless and bare. I thought to myself that this must be the Esker Church, which was on the old Esker road from Tara into Dublin long ago in Ireland, when the High Kings reigned in Tara. I was filled with a terrible morbid curiosity. Was Brothers returning to his grave? Had he found his head? Or was he returning at midnight or in the hours before dawn, after another fruitless night of searching? On an impulse, I went in. I must have been mad. The graveyard as well as the church must be disused, I thought, because rubble and smashed gravestones seemed to litter the ground wherever I looked. And there were trees and great overgrown bushes that occupied part of the ground and threw everything into a play of moonlight and shadows. I couldn't make anything out. There could be shadows moving through the place. It could be full of silent people, and I wouldn't know. I stood there, feeling very cold, wondering if Felix Brothers' grave was indeed here, and if he was back in it now. After standing there for a while, though, I got the feeling I was being watched. I looked around slowly, trying not to betray me mounting unease, and sure enough, over in the shadows somewhere, I saw a face looking at me. I suppressed an urge to leg it out there, for I needed to know who this was more than anything else. So I went over to him to see what he wanted. I didn't speak, neither did he. When I got close, me blood froze. It wasn't a man standing there. It was just a head, a severed head, laid on top of a mound that was surrounded by bushes. Whoever he was, he had no body. God between us and all harm, I blurted out. Who or what are you? Brothers? All Irishmen are brothers, he said quietly. Listen, Mr. Brothers, says I, your body is out there looking for you for 50 years and more. Would you not like to be reunited, for God's sake? Maybe then you could be at peace. Don't you want to go back in your body? I said. Maybe you could be buried together then and find peace. Wouldn't you like that now? No, I need not, and my body is always at hand to carry me onwards, said the head. For now I can think clearly. I can be the man I was meant to be. There's many a head that's been without its body, and it was none the worse for it, especially if head and body were separated in a noble cause. At this, a shadowy figure emerged from the bushes. I let a cry of fright. It was a headless man, the same I had seen and followed through the lich gate. Now, in the pale moonlight, I could see him more clearly. He was wearing a green riding coat, pale breeches, and high-top boots of an old-fashioned sort. Under his arm, he carried what appeared to be a cocked hat. Peace, brother, said the head to me. It's only my body. The body walked steadily over to the head, picked it up carefully, and then sat down, holding the head in its lap. Then the head spoke, addressing himself to me. Fear not, brother, all is well. You are in true Irish patriotic company, for I am Robert Emmet. You have heard of me, no doubt. I examined the handsome features and realised the head spoke true, for I had seen pictures of Robert Emmet on trial for his life in Green Street Courthouse. Oh, aye, I hastened to assure him. I have been hearing about you since I was at school, how you rose for Irish freedom, but were condemned at Green Street Courthouse by Lord Norbury, and then, in Thomas Street, were hung and beheaded, said the head determinedly. Aye, I said, and then what happened nobody knows. You had said that till Ireland was free, no man was to write your epitaph. They might like to do it now, but they don't know where your grave is, let alone find the gravestone to write it on. That is so, said the head, speaking in calmer tones than I knew I had. When I was hung and beheaded, that night I rose up, took my head in my hands, and went off to find a fitting grave. But I never found one. I am still without a grave, and that is why I wander the roads at night like this. Sometimes I meet Lord Norbury passing in his coach. The head chuckled. The coachman slows down when he sees me, but Norbury is always too fearful to take me beside him, for he knows who I am, and he tells the coachman to whip up the horses and drive on. The head looked at me for a while, as if taking me in for the first time. Do you know much about me? We all know the speech from the dock, says I. When me country takes her place among the nations of the earth, then, and not till then, let me epitaph be written. I heard that so many times from me father. A noble sentiment, to be sure. But I don't think I ever really understood it. Why was it so important to you? Well, when I said epitaph, what I really meant was the account of my life, the summing up at the end. Under the rule of the British, I could not expect that any public statement would do me justice. That is why I wanted to wait till Ireland was a nation before anyone should talk about me. And talk about me ye do, I know. What about you, brother? Do you have poems or songs about me?" "Oh, aye. Tom Moore, your friend, wrote one called 'She is far from the land where her young hero sleeps.' That was about Miss Sarah Curden." "Ah, yes, Sarah," said the head with a sigh, "who was to have been my bride, and the man who was to have been my father-in-law, John Philpot Curran, would not defend me in the courtroom at Green Street." "And that reminds me, I have a song too." I began to sing in a faltering voice. "In Green Street Courthouse he stood in the dock, as Lord Norbury, the hanging judge, looked down. Against his false charges stood firm as a rock, another Irish martyr to the crown." "Aye, so it was," said the head with a rueful smile, "and I am glad to be remembered in the songs of the people, though my grave is unknown and my headstone uninscribed, for on my wanderings I have never found a grave." Taking courage, I went on and sang the chorus. "There are still men in Ireland, both loyal and true, who remember their patriots with pride. And with God's help, young Emmet, we'll soon give to you the epitaph unwritten since you died." The head smiled. "It is good to hear Irish story and song," he said quietly, "to know that I live in the people's memory." "Have you not stories and songs yourself?" I asked him. "For your head puts me in mind of the story of Donbo. That's an old Irish story." I never heard such a story. But then again, when I was growing up, we did not hear much of the old tales of Ireland. "Tell it to me." "As I recall," I told him, "Donbo was famed as a minstrel in Ulster, and he was in the service of Fergal, the King of Ulster. No one sang or played better, or told better stories than that young man Donbo. Now Fergal went down to fight the men of Leinster, and he took Donbo with him to provide music and song and story at night. They were encamped on the hill of Allen the night before the battle. King Fergal called upon Donbo to entertain the company gathered around the campfire, but Donbo was full of foreboding about the morrow, and he could not. He promised Fergal he'd sing and play for him on the following night, wherever they might be. Well, on the next day, the victory was to the Leinster men, and Fergal fell in battle, and so did Donbo too, and many others from Ulster. And that night, as the men of Leinster were celebrating their victory at their camp nearby, the King of Leinster, Murcha, who was merry enough at this stage, dared one of his warriors to go out on the deserted battlefield and bring back a trophy. Now, none of them would have wanted to go out where the ghosts of the dead were lamenting, and perhaps seeking revenge on their enemies. But this man accepted the challenge of his king, and went out. When he walked through the silent battlefield, full of the corpses of the slain, his heart was in his mouth with fear, till he began to hear a voice singing a beautiful song. He followed the sound, and among the bushes he saw a severed head that was singing. It lay upon the ground beside its gory body, but it was looking upward sadly as it sang, and it caught his eye. Mastered in his fright and dread, the warrior asked who this might be. The head replied that he was Donbo, minstrel of Ulster. He had promised his king Fergal that he would sing to him and entertain him this night, and both he and Fergal were among the slain here, but he was keeping his promise. And so he sang on. Shakespeare no moran, Gurbaho moran, Dagaver no lash in Alaquan. The Leinster warrior, moved by the beauty of this song, asked if he might bring his head to Murcha's campfire and make him comfortable there, so that they might hear him sing there too. Donbo consented, on condition that he be brought back again to where his body lay before dawn. So the warrior gave his word, and he brought Donbo's head to Murracha's campfire, and he set it on a rock there. And Donbo sang beautiful songs. He answered their questions, and he told them stories. His songs were so beautiful, and his mourning for the fallen so noble, that the Leinster men forgot their carouse and wept and mourned as he sang. They could only think of the pity of battle, for a battle won is also a battle lost, and they wept for the Ulster warriors and the homes and families to which they would never return. King Murracha was tearful and silent too, and before daybreak the warrior who had brought Donbo's head stole back to the battlefield with it and placed it on his body. I stopped, for I had heard something in the quiet of the countryside. It was horses' hooves and wheels thundering along the road. I looked at the head. Our eyes met. "We know who that is, do we not?" he said with a sigh. The body rose and, lifting the head, put it on its neck. It seemed to sit there securely for now. On the head it put a cocked hat with a tricolour cockade. We went out to the Lich Gate and stood by the side of the road. An 18th century coach, drawn by a team of 4 pale horses, approached in the moonlight. On the box in front I could see 2 coachmen in livery. Lord Norbury had had a hard day. He had sat in judgment on crimes both great and small. He had sentenced men to be hung, drawn and quartered, sent to prison, transported to the colonies and flogged back and forth across the Liffey. When it was all done, he just wanted to go home to Clane. His head ached and his foot ached too, with the beginnings of an attack of gout. Devil take that port! But he felt like nothing more than a glass of port, or 2, or more. But the coach rumbled along steadily, the harness jingled, and the whole effect was soothing. Testily, though, he noticed now that the coach was slowing down and coming to a stop. He poked his head out the window. "Why are you stopping?" he shouted. "It's for Mr. Emmet, your lordship," sang out the coachman. "Not Emmet again," groaned his lordship. The coach had come to a stop at the gate of the Esker graveyard. Emmet stepped out of the shadows. This time his head was on his body, and he wore his cocked hat with the tricolour cockade. He spoke. "You, my lord, are a judge. I am the supposed culprit." Lord Norbury put his face in his hands. He groaned. "Not you, young Emmet. Not tonight. Anyone but you. I am a man. You are a man also. By a revolution of power we might change places, though we could never change characters." His voice died away in the silence of the countryside. The horses pawed the ground impatiently with their hooves. "Drive on," said Lord Norbury hollowly to the coachman. But the coachman didn't move. "Without Mr. Emmet, your lordship," said a quiet voice beside the coachman on the box. "Treason!" roared the old man. "I'll have you all flogged and hanged. Drive on." Robert Emmet took off his cocked hat with a flourish and bowed. At this, his head fell from his body onto the road. There he stood, frozen in the gesture of a courtly bow, with arms extended gracefully from his sides and one foot placed neatly before the other. The head in its cocked hat now lay upon the ground. The eyes seemed to be looking up at his lordship. The old man screamed in terror. "Drive on, for God's sake!" The coachman at last cracked his whip, and the team of horses took off, the coach lurching after them. The coachman now drove on at a great clip, and the galloping hoofs of the horses were loud on the road, and so was the jingling of harness, till they reached Murray's Inn. Then the coach slowed down. "Why are you stopping now?" roared his lordship out the open window. "To greet a man by the roadside," sang out the coachman. "Move! Move, I said," roared his lordship. "It is late, and we have lost too much time as it is. I will speak to no man this night, no matter who he is." "Are not all men brothers?" he heard the other coachman say. "Treason," he muttered. But the coachman didn't seem to hear him, and the coach slowed to a stop. They were just outside the inn, Dead Man Murray's, as he remembered it was called. In spite of himself, he shuddered with dread. There stood the old inn in the moonlight, not a light burning in a window, for the landlord and the guests must all be abed. In the silence and the darkness, he heard cocks begin to crow in the distance. Good God, it was already just before dawn. They had been driving all night. Would they ever get home? The horses snorted and pawed the ground. His lordship saw a movement in the gloom outside. It was the figure of a man. He watched him coming stealthily towards the door of the coach like a footpad. Or perhaps he was just one of a whole gang of assassins waiting in the shadows. He remembered well what had happened to the former Chief Justice, Lord Kilwarden. Emmet's men had stopped his coach on the road the night of the rebellion, and when the rascals asked his name and he said who he was, they cried, "He's the one we want," and dragged him out of the coach and killed him with their pikes. They had shown no mercy to poor Kilwarden. Why should they show any mercy to him, who had no mercy? Lord Norbury shrank back among his cushions, staring out the open window at what was coming. The man who now approached him, seemingly alone, wore no coat, but a dark suit of a kind that his lordship had never seen, and under it a white shirt without a neckband. Then he realised to his horror that the man had no head. Was it Emmet then, back to haunt him? He shrank on his cushions in dread. The headless man advanced to the door and put his hand on the windowsill. If he had a head, he would be looking in, examining the inside of the vehicle. But he had not, and where his head should be, there was only a neck crowned with great amounts of congealed blood. He stood there, as if in mute inquiry. Was he asking his name? God forbid. If this was Emmet, he knew his name. He didn't need to ask. And how could he ask without a head? But the headless man seemed to weary of this, and he walked away silently. Just then, a cock crowed nearby, from the stables behind the inn. And the hanging judge, his body bent forward, leaned on the windowsill of his coach and wept bitterly. Yous have been listening to Headless Wanderers by Turlough Con Me from 13 Tales Told by a Dubliner. If yous enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, subscribe, share and comment. And so, until next time.